The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and Rachel Torres had learned long ago not to flinch at that sound. She'd learned not to flinch at many things. The night shift assignment at Oak Creek Memorial sat printed on her phone at 11:22 p.m., 12 hours in the trauma ward, the temp nurse slot that nobody wanted, the cases that came in when the skeleton crew was running on fumes and cold coffee. She read the assignment twice. Room 304. Captain James Torres. Paralyzed Special Forces veteran. Admitted 3 days ago after a spinal cord injury that left him from the chest down without feeling, without movement, without the use of the body that had carried him through 17 deployments across 3 continents. Rachel's hand steadied against the steering wheel of her 2008 Honda Civic as she sat in the hospital parking lot. The engine ticked. The rain hammered Denver in sheets, the kind of rain that came late in October, the kind that felt like the sky was angry. She'd memorized the name in the assignment the moment she saw it. James Torres. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd stood at her door in dress blues at 6:22 a.m. on a Tuesday in spring, and behind him there had been 2 more officers, and one of them had carried a folded flag like it weighed 10,000 pounds. The man who'd sent Marcus home in a casket. The man who'd written her a letter afterward that had sat unopened on her kitchen counter for 8 months before she finally read it, and even then she'd only read it once, in the dark, at 3 a.m., and then she'd burned it in the sink. She grabbed her scrubs from the passenger seat. Charcoal grey, worn soft from 1,000 washings. Her badge was clipped to the lanyard around her neck, the temporary credentials that made her legal but not official, present but not permanent, the kind of invisibility that Rachel had learned to navigate like a language. She'd become fluent in it over the past 5 years. The badge had her photograph from 6 months ago, when she'd still looked like she was running from something. Now she just looked tired. That was better. The hospital doors opened with a pneumatic sigh, and the smell of antiseptic hit first, that sharp, acrid chemical that lived in every hospital in America and probably every hospital anywhere humans tried to keep other humans alive. Underneath it, something else. Something older. Blood and sweat and the particular funk of a place where the body's failures arrived around the clock. Rachel had smelled worse. She'd smelled things in 2019 that had no names in English, in compounds in Helmand Province where the air itself seemed infected. She'd smelled the copper stink of a field hospital in Sanjan Valley, had stood in surgical bays that were really tense, had held pressure on wounds that could never be fixed by pressure alone. That was a different life. That was a life that had been officially erased. She made her way to the 4th floor. The elevator was one of those old ones that moved like it was considering whether the trip was worth the effort. 2 nurses in blue scrubs stood near the station, talking quietly. They looked up as she passed, made the calculation that she was staff, and looked away. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked her name. This was the gift of the night shift. The bureaucracy slept, and the people who worked the dark hours were mostly just trying to survive until the sun came up. Room 304 was at the end of the hallway, past the supply closet and the storage room where they kept extra blankets. Rachel stood outside the door for 13 seconds. She could see through the small window in the upper portion that Captain Torres was awake. The overhead light cast everything in a wash of white that made human skin look like canvas. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and his hands lay flat on the bed beside him, hands that had gripped rifles and climbed ropes and held the lives of other soldiers in their palms. Now they were just hands. Hands that didn't move. Hands that probably didn't feel anything at all. She opened the door. It whispered on its hinges. Captain Torres. I'm Rachel. Night shift nurse. Her voice came out level, professional, the way she'd practiced it in her apartment 1,000 times. The way she'd learned to speak in this new life where she was nobody important, just somebody with a temporary badge and a stethoscope and hands that remembered things she was never supposed to remember. I'll be with you until morning. Anything you need, you ask. His eyes moved toward her. Blue eyes. The kind of blue that came from Scandinavian ancestry, that looked wrong in the tanned face of a man who'd spent most of his adult life in deserts. He'd aged since the funeral. Of course he had. 5 years had passed, and he'd spent them paralyzed, and that was a different kind of aging, the kind that happened from the inside out. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse. That's kind of you." Rachel nodded once and turned to check the fall line, the monitors, the vital signs. His heart rate was elevated. Blood pressure slightly high. O2 sat at 94%, which was acceptable. The chart in his file showed he'd been stable since admission, no acute complications, just the slow business of learning to live in a body that had stopped listening to him. She made notes on the clipboard. The fluorescent light above his bed was the same as the ones in the hallway, the same as the ones in 1,000 other rooms in 1,000 other hospitals. She'd learned to work in that light. She'd learned to do a lot of things. An hour later, Dr. Lawrence Hargrove arrived to make rounds. She recognized him before she saw his name on the coat. There was a particular kind of man who moved through hospitals like he owned them, the kind whose shoes were polished, whose stethoscope hung around his neck like a trophy, whose voice took up space like water finding all the cracks in a room. He was in his early 60s, Rachel guessed. Silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that came from generations of people who didn't have to worry about much. He'd never been afraid. She could tell by the way he held his shoulders. Captain Torres's family was there. His mother sat in the corner chair, a woman in her 80s with Captain Torres's blue eyes and his careful way of sitting. His sister stood by the window. His brother was there too, younger, in a suit that probably cost more than Rachel's rent. Dr. Hargrove swept into the room like a man entering a stage, and Rachel saw his eyes land on the fall line, the one she'd just checked 20 minutes ago, the one that had been running exactly as prescribed. He looked at the chart. He looked at Rachel. Then he looked back at the chart. "Who adjusted this medication?" His voice had that particular quality of a man asking a question he'd already decided the answer to. "The dosage is per protocol," Rachel said. Her hands were steady at her sides. "I verified it against the prescription." "I didn't ask for your verification," Dr. Hargrove said. His voice was quiet. That was worse than if he'd yelled. "I asked who adjusted the medication." "You?" "Without consulting me." Captain Torres's mother shifted forward slightly in her chair. The sister's eyes widened. Rachel felt all of them looking at her, the family, Captain Torres himself, the weight of their attention like something physical pressing against her chest. The dosage was incorrect, Rachel said, and the lie tasted like ash, but she held it in her mouth without blinking, without flinching, without letting any of it show on her face. "I corrected it per standard nursing protocol. The medication is appropriate for the patient's current presentation." "You're a temp," Dr. Hargrove said. He was still looking at the chart, not at her, which somehow made it worse. "You've been here less than 2 hours. And you decided that my prescriptions require your correction." "I checked the dosage," Rachel said quietly. "It was a medication safety check. That's my job." He closed the chart. The sound it made was like a door slamming. "Don't do that again. You follow my orders exactly as written. Nothing more. You're not a doctor. You're just a nurse." He left. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. The room felt smaller after he left, the air pressure different, like something had shifted and reset. Captain Torres's mother was staring at her hands. The sister looked away. Rachel returned to the monitors, to the vital signs, to the work that needed doing. Her jaw was tight, but her hands didn't shake. She'd been called worse. She'd been called worse in rooms with people dying, in conditions she couldn't have imagined 5 years ago, when she was someone else and the world still knew her name. She opened her locker in the staff break room at 1:33 a.m. The space was small, painted institutional beige, with 3 shelves and a hanging rod. Her personal items were minimal, a change of scrubs, a water bottle, a granola bar she'd never eat. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, was a pair of combat boots. They were old. The tan leather was scuffed in patterns that told the story of 17 years of deployment, desert heat, mountain terrain, the particular wear of a woman who'd walked everywhere, climbed everything, done whatever was needed. The laces were frayed. The right heel was cracked. The left boot had a dark stain on the inside that she'd never cleaned off because it was the only physical evidence left that it had been hers, that she'd worn them, that she'd existed in a life where she was someone who owned things like combat boots. Marcus had bought them for her in 2004. She could still see him in the shop in San Diego, running his thumb across the leather, asking her if they felt right in her feet, knowing that she would never admit if they didn't, knowing that she would just wear them until they fit her properly, which was how she handled everything. She'd worn them through Kandahar province and Fallujah and 3 different duty stations and a promotion that had come with a security clearance that was now officially revoked. She'd worn them in 2019, the year everything changed, the year of the operation that had gone wrong, the extraction that had been classified, the decisions that had been made in rooms Rachel hadn't been allowed to enter. After that, they'd told her to disappear. They'd given her a new name in paperwork, a scrubbed identity, and a warning not to surface. Marcus was already gone by then, a heart attack at 41, which was the way things happened sometimes, sudden, without asking permission. The boots had been all she'd managed to keep. She ran her hand along the leather. The material was still warm somehow, even though they'd been sitting in her locker for a week. She could feel the calluses on her palms, the particular texture of hands that had done more than hold stethoscopes. Those hands had done other things. Those hands had pressed on wounds and gripped tactical gear and held the lives of soldiers in their palms, and then they'd been told to forget all of that. To become someone else. To be just a nurse. Rachel closed her locker. Her shift was only 8 hours old. She returned to room 304 at 2:06 a.m. Captain Torres was asleep, his breathing even, his heart rate down to 58 beats per minute. She checked the 4 line carefully, compared it to the prescription in his chart. Dr. Hargrove had written the order in his own hand, the handwriting sharp and fast, the kind of writing that came from someone who'd done it 10,000 times and wasn't bothering with neatness anymore. The dosage on the paper did not match the dosage running through the line. She knew medication. She'd been trained by military medical specialists in field conditions, had been certified 3 times over, had stood in surgical bays and made dosing calculations under pressure. The medication running through Captain Torres's for was triple the prescribed amount. It was a mistake. Or it wasn't. She stood there for 40 seconds, looking at the paper, looking at the 4, looking at the man in the bed who'd lost everything and was now being overdosed by the doctor who was supposed to be saving him. She had options. She could call Dr. Hargrove and point out the error. She could adjust the line herself and document it. She could walk away and let the medication run and let the morning shift find whatever happened next. She could call someone else, notify someone, create a paper trail that would lead back to her, to the woman with a temporary badge and a 5-year employment gap and hands that didn't match her credentials. Rachel opened the medication log on the chart. There was a line for notes. Next to Dr. Hargrove's handwritten prescription, someone had written in different handwriting, someone with careful, precise penmanship, verified with pharmacy at 18:47 hours. Dosage confirmed. J. A. Martinez, RN. She knew that handwriting. She'd seen it on 3 other charts that week. She'd seen it paired with notations that made no sense, prescriptions that had been verified but didn't match the volumes, charges that appeared in billing records for medications never administered, treatments never performed. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it. She had a choice. She was trained to see those kinds of patterns. Trained in Marjah, trained in Sanjin, trained in places where the enemy wore 1,000 different faces, and sometimes the danger came from the people in your own unit, the ones who decided to take what wasn't theirs to take. That training was 5 years buried under the cover of a temporary nurse, under the weight of a scrubbed identity and a man telling her to disappear and never surface. Rachel adjusted the 4 line down to the correct dosage. She documented it carefully in the chart. She signed her name, the name that wasn't her name, the name that had been assigned to her by a government that had decided she no longer officially existed. Then she returned to the monitors and watched Captain Torres sleep, his heart rate steady, his blood pressure normalizing, and she wondered how long it had been since anyone had actually saved his life instead of just trying to. The break room door opened at 2:22 a.m. Rachel carried her thermos and a protein bar, moving to the far corner table where the fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly white. She'd learned to sit away from the group. Easier that way. The permanent staff sat clustered near the coffee station, 3 nurses, 1 respiratory tech, all mid-conversation about weekend plans. They'd been laughing. Genuine laughter, the kind that fills a room. Rachel unwrapped her bar and opened her laptop to check Captain Torres's overnight labs. Then something shifted. One nurse stood. Not abruptly. Casual. She gathered her things, whispered something, and the other 2 rose without a word. They moved past Rachel's table in formation, close enough that she caught the deliberate scrape of their chairs, the intentional silence where conversation had been. They migrated to the opposite corner. Their laughter resumed. Rachel's hands didn't pause. She kept eating, kept reading the monitor data scrolling across her screen. 1 measured breath. That's all she allowed herself. In and out. The kind of breathing that came from 17 years of maintaining composure when every nerve ending wanted to scream. It was orchestrated. She recognized the choreography. She'd seen it before, in forward operating bases where junior enlisted soldiers were being punished by a command structure. The silent exit. The regrouping. The performance of exclusion. Dr. Hargrove hadn't needed to say a word. He'd simply mentioned to someone, probably the charge nurse, that Rachel's presence at the table was disruptive, and like dominoes, the permanent staff had received their signal. She finished her protein bar. Drank her coffee. Logged out of the patient system. 43 minutes remained of her break, but she returned to the unit instead. Captain Torres lay still in room 304, his breathing steady through the ventilator. The monitors showed his heart rhythm in a perfect sinus pattern, O2 saturation holding at 96%. She adjusted his full line, checked the flow rate on his antibiotics, 1 gram vancomycin every 12 hours, and made a note in his chart. His family had visited earlier. They'd asked her why the captain wasn't improving faster. She'd explained the complications from his initial injury, the spinal shock that persisted, the infections that plagued paralyzed patients. They'd listened politely and then looked at her the way people look at service workers, acknowledged, then invisible. The next morning, Dr. Hargrove arrived at 6:41 a.m. Rachel was finishing her shift report, documenting Captain Torres's vitals and the new antibiotic regimen she'd recommended after reviewing his infection patterns. She hadn't stepped outside her scope of practice. She'd simply flagged a concern using the hospital's protocol for nursing intervention on medication orders. He'd responded by documenting that concern, incorrectly, as insubordination and failure to maintain professional boundaries. The write-up was posted on the unit board. Not in the administrative office. Not in a private meeting. On the public board where every nurse, every tech, every resident saw it when they arrived for shift change. Rachel stood 3 feet away, pretending to scan the schedule, while Dr. Hargrove leaned against the desk nearby with 2 residents flanking him like court attendants. Some nurses struggle with their scope of practice, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Some seem to think they're physicians. Rachel didn't turn. She didn't speak. She simply finished reading the schedule and walked back to her station. But Dr. Hargrove needed more. He needed her to break. He crossed the unit, positioned himself directly in front of her workstation where Captain Torres's monitor beeped its steady rhythm, and smiled the smile of a man who believed he already owned the outcome. "You've been very helpful," he said, the words shaped like kindness but weighted with contempt. "In fact, you've been so helpful that I'm recommending we use your expertise more efficiently. I'd like you to manage the supply inventory for the entire unit. You can start tonight. Stockroom is in basement 2. The temperature in the room didn't change, but Rachel felt it, the trap disguised as an assignment. Basement 2 meant no patient care. Basement 2 meant isolation. Basement 2 meant she'd lose access to Captain Torres's care while simultaneously being made invisible to the medical team. It was a reassignment that looked like promotion on paper. She met his eyes. One measured breath. Her voice emerged low and steady, each word placed like stones across still water. Some of us serve without needing credit for it. Dr. Hargrove's smile faltered. For a moment, just a flash, she saw something flicker across his face. Not confusion. Recognition. As if he'd just noticed something he'd missed before. The way she stood. The way her hands moved. The way she said the word surf like it meant something he'd never actually understood. But he was too arrogant to truly see her. What he saw was a temp nurse with no job security, no references, no leverage. A woman he could grind into dust with a single phone call to the agency. She was disposable. She was already gone. What he didn't know, what no one at Oak Creek Memorial could possibly know, was that she'd spent the last 72 hours watching his billing patterns. The suspicious overnight charges. The procedures listed on invoices that didn't match the actual care Captain Torres had received. The kickback scheme building itself in real time through inflated claims and phantom services. She'd recognized it because she'd seen it before, in forward operating bases where supply officers skimmed from unit budgets. Different context. Same mathematics of theft. Rachel was already a threat. But she wasn't the threat he thought she was. She wasn't someone he needed to destroy to protect his job. She was someone he needed to destroy before she noticed he was stealing. The night shift continued. At 3:06 a.m., Captain Torres's chest began to rise and fall unevenly. His breathing turned shallow, labored. The ventilator alarmed, airway pressure rising, saturation dropping. 89%. 84%. Rachel stood immediately. The on-call resident was a young man, talented but unpracticed in crisis. He stared at the monitor, processing. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Rachel moved to the bedside. Tension pneumothorax. His chest is rigid. How do you? Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. She wasn't asking. The voice that came out of her mouth wasn't the voice of the temp nurse who sat alone in the break room. It was deeper. It carried the weight of command. It carried 17 years of decisions made under fire when hesitation meant body bags. The resident froze. Rachel opened the crash cart. Found the 14-gauge needle. Prepped the site with antiseptic that smelled of iodine and clarity. The needle was already in her hand. She moved like she'd done this 1,000 times, because she had. Not in a hospital. In the back of a Chinook helicopter crossing the Helmand Valley. In a forward surgical tent where the ceiling was canvas and the light came from chemical glow sticks. In 17 different operating theaters where the only rule was, make the call or watch them die. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. The sound of life returning. Captain Torres's chest expanded. His saturation climbed. 91%. 94%. 98%. His breathing steadied. The alarm silenced. The monitors returned to their steady beeping, the sound of a man no longer dying. The fluorescent lights hummed. The room held its breath. Dr. Hargrove arrived 20 minutes later. Not alone. Never alone. 2 board members he'd called at home. Hospital security. An investigator from an outside firm, a woman with a folder and a recorder and the kind of expression that said she'd already decided what she was looking for. Rachel Torres, she said, reading from her paperwork as if reading a death sentence, we have an anonymous complaint that you performed a needle decompression without physician authorization. That constitutes practicing medicine without a license. Rachel had known this was coming. The moment she'd moved differently, the moment her hands had remembered their real training, she'd known she was finished at Oak Creek Memorial. The monitor started screaming at 3 in the morning. Rachel was charting in the alcove outside Captain Torres's room when the alarm pierced through the unit, not the soft chime of a routine alert, but the sustained wail that meant something had catastrophically failed. She moved before her brain had finished processing, legs carrying her toward room 304 on instinct older than her civilian identity. The captain's chest was rigid. His lips had gone the color of wet concrete, a shade between blue and gray that meant minutes, not hours. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but something was profoundly wrong. The air going in had nowhere to go. The bag was ballooning with each compression attempt, resistance increasing, oxygen saturation numbers dropping like a stone down a well. Dr. Mitchell, the on-call resident, stood frozen at the bedside, hands hovering near the patient's chest as if proximity alone could solve the problem. His mouth was open. No words. No orders. No attempt to call for help. Just the mechanical sound of panic settling into his bones. What's his pressure? Rachel's voice had changed. 2 octaves lower. Not a question. A demand. We need to. Mitchell turned toward her, his face pale as the fluorescent lighting above them. His pressure. Now. 60/40. It's dropping. Rachel was already moving. She grabbed the crash cart with one hand, muscle memory pulling her toward the medication tray with the precision of someone who had done this in sandstorms and convoy ambushes, not just in climate-controlled hospital rooms. Her fingers found the 18-gauge needle before she could think about what her fingers were doing. The syringe was already in her other hand. The motion was automatic. The kind of automatic that came from 17 deployments and 243 field emergencies that her official record claimed never happened. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said, not to anyone specific, just stating the anatomy like it was gospel written in muscle and bone. Mitchell stepped back. Good. Smart. He knew something was happening that existed outside his training. Captain Torres's skin was cool and clammy under Rachel's left hand. She found the space between the second and third ribs, where the needle needed to go to release the air that was crushing his lungs from the inside. The captain had been paralyzed for 8 months, hadn't moved from the waist down since the IED in Marjah had taken that from him, but his body still remembered how to try to breathe. His shoulders heaved. His neck corded with the effort of pulling air into lungs that were being compressed by their own atmosphere. The needle went in. The hiss came immediately, sharp, distinct, the sound of a system equalizing. The sound of pressure releasing. Captain Torres's chest dropped by 2 millimeters. The tension broke like a fever. Saturation? Rachel kept the needle in place, holding pressure. 68, Mitchell said. His voice was shaking. Get a 14-gauge angiocath in here. Now. The nurse tech appeared from the corridor before Rachel had finished the sentence. Not Mitchell. Someone competent. Someone who understood that the quiet temp in the scrubs had just taken command of the room the same way a conductor takes up a baton, and everything else was following her rhythm now. The angiocath went in next to the needle. The definitive airway for a tension pneumothorax. Rachel had placed thousands of them, in field hospitals, in convoy vehicles, in the back of a medevac Black Hawk with rotors thundering overhead and zero visibility and nothing but the patient and the procedure and the sound of her own breathing, steady as a metronome. Saturation numbers started climbing. 72. The captain's lips were still blue, but the muscles in his neck were beginning to relax. His eyes were wide, locked on Rachel's face, and she realized he was recognizing something in her. Not her name. Not the fact that she'd been his young soldier's last phone call before the coffin came home. He was recognizing the way her hands moved. The way she commanded space without raising her voice. The way she was saving his life with the kind of competence that didn't exist in civilian medicine. 79. Epi? She said it like a question, but Mitchell was already drawing the dose without asking. 1 milligram. She'd see it in the 4-line a moment later, watch it work through his system like electricity through copper wiring. 85. The captain's color was starting to return. Not pink yet. Not normal. But the trajectory was right. The death had stopped coming for him and reversed course. 88. Rachel kept the angiocath steady, her hand as still as the night outside the window. Through the glass, Denver lay dark and sleeping, unaware that in this small room on the 4th floor, a paralyzed captain was being pulled back from a collapse that should have killed him within the next 60 seconds. 92. Stable. The monitor found a rhythm. Not perfect. Not what it had been before the pneumothorax had collapsed his right lung. But sinus. Organized. A heartbeat that was actually trying. Captain Torres's breathing had evened out. The ventilator was doing its job now instead of fighting against a closed system. His eyes were still on Rachel's, and in that moment, with the captain watching her with the absolute certainty of a man who had just seen something impossible, she knew she was finished at Oak Creek Memorial. The door opened behind her. What happened? It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Dr. Hargrove stood in the threshold, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair uncombed. He'd been called in. Which meant someone had paged him about the crisis. Which meant he was about to see exactly what Rachel had just done and understand exactly what it meant about the person doing it. She didn't turn around. She kept her hand steady on the angiocath, kept her eyes on Captain Torres's monitor, kept her breathing level and controlled because the only thing standing between this man and unconscious panic was the absolute certainty that the procedure was secured. Tension pneumothorax, Rachel said. Her voice was still low. Still commanding. Still unmistakably someone who had done this before. Right-sided collapse. Decompressed at 3:22 a.m. Saturation recovered from 68 to 92. Blood pressure stabilizing. The numbers hung in the air. Mitchell was looking at his shoes. The nurse tech was very carefully checking the fall line. And Dr. Hargrove was staring at Rachel's hands, at the steady grip, the precise angle of the needle, the absolute absence of anything resembling hesitation or doubt. You performed a procedure beyond your scope of practice, Hargrove said. Not a question. A statement. Already factual. Already weaponized. Rachel finally looked at him. One measured breath. One moment of absolute clarity where she understood that this man was going to burn everything down to hide what he'd just witnessed, and she was going to let him do it because explaining herself would mean answering questions about the 5-year gap in her work history and why a temporary nurse moved through an emergency like she'd spent 2 decades doing exactly this in places that officially didn't exist. The patient was exsanguinating into his thoracic cavity, Rachel said, still keeping her voice at that low, steady frequency that made every word sound like an order. The resident was frozen. Saturation was dropping. There was no time to wait for procedure authorization. It was all true. It was also completely irrelevant. You'll need to speak with administration, Hargrove said. His jaw had tightened. His eyes had gone cold. And you're reassigned to the basement, effective immediately. No more direct patient care. Rachel nodded once. A slight motion. A gesture that carried the weight of someone who had accepted far worse than desk reassignment. She left the angiocath in the captain's chest with the bag secured, the pressure holding. Left him stabilized and breathing. Left him alive, which was the only metric that had ever mattered to Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, even when she wasn't supposed to be that person anymore. As she walked past Dr. Hargrove into the corridor, she caught her reflection in the darkened window at the hallway's end, not the timid temp nurse in borrowed scrubs, but something else entirely. Something that had been trained to move through war zones and clinical disasters with the same bone-deep competence. Something that had just made a choice, save the man, lose the job, stay invisible. But Hargrove was already moving. Already reaching for his phone. Already activating the network that would turn her rescue into an accusation. She had maybe 24 hours before he moved to destroy her completely. 20 minutes later, the ER doors burst open and Dr. Hargrove entered like a man who'd made phone calls. Hospital security flanked him, 2 uniformed officers with the practiced indifference of men hired to enforce policy, not judgment. Behind them came board members, pulled from their homes at 3 a.m. based on a single conversation. Their faces carried the particular exhaustion of people who'd been told there was a crisis. There wasn't. There was only calculation. Hargrove's eyes found Rachel at the nurse's station, still charting Captain Torres's stabilization. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "We need to speak," he said. "Not a request." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The attending physician who'd arrived at 3:15 a.m. to oversee the crisis, a woman named Dr. Okonkwo who'd watched Rachel work and seen exactly what she could do, stepped between them. The patient stable. Pneumothorax resolved. Her intervention. Beyond her scope, Hargrove cut in. The words came practiced, rehearsed during the drive. "We have protocols for a reason. Nurses assist. Surgeons intervene." She crossed a line that we cannot ignore. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, already thick with papers someone had been preparing before Captain Torres's chest ever went rigid. An anonymous complaint. A summary of scope violations. Forms initialed by board members who weren't even in the building when she'd saved a man's life. One of the security officers stepped forward. "We need your credentials and badge." Rachel didn't look up from the chart. O2 sat 98%. Heart rate steady at 82. Blood pressure normalizing at 118/76. Numbers that meant a man was breathing. Numbers that meant her hands had been right. "You performed a procedure restricted to physicians," the security officer continued, filling the silence with protocol. "The board has authorized an immediate investigation. You're suspended pending findings." Rachel set the pen down with the care of someone placing flowers at a grave. Slowly. Deliberately. Not rushed. Not angry. Just precise, like every movement she'd made for the last 18 years could be measured and found adequate. She looked at Hargrove. Really looked at him, the flush of victory creeping up his neck, the way his fingers flexed like he was already typing her termination notice. He'd called in his network. Board members. The investigator who'd arrived by morning. References he'd contact. A structure of consequence he'd assembled while she'd had her hands inside a man's chest. "I need to speak with my representative," Rachel said. 8 words. Exactly what a lawyer would tell her to say. Hargrove smiled. "You're not in a position to negotiate." She stood and unhooked her badge from her scrubs. Oak Creek Memorial, issued 2 months ago. A temporary credential, issued to people the hospital deemed disposable. The badge clattered against the tile floor with a sound like something small dying. She didn't pick it up. The security officer gestured toward the locker room. "Your personal items. You have 15 minutes. She didn't argue. Didn't ask questions. Didn't demand to speak to anyone. She simply moved, and the group of them, security, board members, Hargrove with his vindication already glowing in his eyes, followed her like sharks that had tasted something promising in the water. The locker room was empty at 3:02 a.m. Fluorescent lights hummed their sterile hymn. Rachel opened her locker, the one in the back corner that no one else ever used, and pulled out the cardboard box she'd brought on her first day. She placed her shoes inside. Her extra scrubs. Her small bottle of hand lotion. And then, from the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper the color of old newspapers, she pulled out the worn combat boots. The leather had cracked decades ago. The laces were knotted in 3 places because soldiers don't throw things away, they repair them and move forward. One of the board members, a thin man whose nameplate read Director Chen, leaned against the doorframe. "You put a lot at risk today, Ms. Torres." She didn't answer. She just held the boots like they weighed more than boots should weigh. Performing procedures without licensure, Chen continued, almost gently. Overstepping boundaries with the physician. "We can't condone that, regardless of the outcome." Rachel placed the boots in the box and closed the locker door. The sound echoed. Everything echoed in empty rooms. She picked up the cardboard box. It wasn't heavy, which meant her entire temporary life fit inside something a grocery store would throw away, and walked past them. Hargrove stepped aside. He was already thinking about his next move, his next call. He'd won this round. The real victory was already secured. She was gone before she could ask too many questions about his billing patterns. The rain started somewhere around 4 a.m., thick and cold, the kind of Denver rain that came in September when summer was still pretending and the mountains remembered what cold actually meant. Rachel sat in her sedan in the hospital parking garage for 20 minutes, watching water sheet down the windshield. She'd driven this car, a 2011 Nissan Altima, purchased used from a fleet sale, for the past 4 years. It smelled like coffee and laundry detergent and the faint ghost of other lives, other people who'd sat in these seats before her. She didn't drive home. She drove north to Mountain View Cemetery, where the rain fell harder, where the stones all looked the same even though the people beneath them had been radically, irreplaceably different. Marcus Torres's grave was in the southeast section, row 44, plot 7. She'd been here once every month for 5 years, always on a different day so no pattern would form, so no one monitoring her would see routine. The headstone was simple granite. No flags. No military insignia. The Pentagon had been very clear, nothing that suggested she'd married into service, nothing that connected her to anything classified. So it just said Marcus Torres, 1979 to 2017, beloved husband. A blank space where his rank should have been. An erasure written in stone. Rachel stood at the grave in the cold rain and pressed her forehead against the wet stone. The temperature shocked her skin. Good. Pain was information. Pain meant something was still working, still responding, still functional. I saved him, Marcus, she whispered. Her voice cracked like old leather. I saved James's life and they still threw me away. I performed the decompression, you were right about the training, it all came back, my hands moved and the air came out and his O2 climbed and his breathing now, Marcus, he's actually breathing, and they fired me for it. They fired me for saving him. The rain hit harder. It ran down her face and she didn't wipe it away. Soldiers don't cry, her instructor had said in 2003, when she was 22 and still believed rules were different things than promises. But she wasn't a soldier anymore. She was just a woman standing in a graveyard, holding a box containing a pair of boots that nobody was supposed to know she owned. I've got nothing left to prove I was ever worth anything, she said to the stone, to the ground, to the version of Marcus that lived only in the 5 years of silence after the flag was folded. No discharge papers. No service record. No medals. Just boots and a story that'll get me disappeared if I tell it. I'm supposed to be nobody. And I did what nobody would do, and it still wasn't enough. She stood there for 3 minutes. Just stood, rain soaking through her scrubs, her cardboard box getting soft at the edges. And then she heard it. Faint at first, so faint she thought it might be thunder. But it came again, lower and deeper, a sound like the earth was clearing its throat. Helicopter rotors. Moving south toward Denver. Moving fast. Rachel looked up from the grave, rain streaming down her face, and something in her chest that had been locked away for 5 years began to turn. 24 hours after surrender, Rachel stacked boxes in her apartment when the windows rattled. Not thunder. Not wind. A military convoy rolled up her street, 3 hums, and a black SUV stopping directly outside her building. Boots on pavement. Doors slamming in unison. She froze, cardboard box suspended in both hands, and for the first time since the rain at the cemetery, something shifted in her chest, not hope, but the skeletal shape of it. Recognition. A man climbed her stairs. She knew the face before the knock landed. Commander Travis Holloway, callsign Ghost, the only SEAL she'd worked with who'd never filed a debriefing about her. He stood in her doorway with his dress uniform still carrying the weight of Denver rain and said, Senior Chief Torres, you're needed at the VA Medical Center. Captain Torres requested you by name. Not a question. Not a suggestion. The kind of statement that moved mountains. I can't, Rachel said, but the words felt hollow. They both knew she could. Not a request. Holloway stepped inside without waiting for permission. Cars running downstairs. Let's move. The Denver VA Medical Center hummed with the particular tension that comes when protocol fractures. They walked past security guards who nodded rather than checked credentials. That was Holloway's work, the invisible weight of rank pulling strings 3 levels deep. On the 3rd floor, in a private room overlooking the city, Rachel's son stood in dress blues. Not the uniform of a junior officer. Full dress. Decorations catching light like broken glass. He looked at her and his voice cracked exactly once. "Mom, they told me you were just a nurse." The word sat between them, enormous and irretrievable. Captain James Torres stood beside him, trembling but standing, no longer paralyzed, no longer just surviving. His hands shook as he handed Rachel a classified file, redacted corners, official seals, a thickness that represented 5 years erased from history. He opened it with the reverence of a man handling sacred text. Started reading aloud. Bronze Star. His voice wavered. Bronze Star, 2nd award. He swallowed hard. Navy Cross. That's when his eyes filled. 17 combat deployments. Operation Inherit Shadow. Operation Silent Tide. Operation. He couldn't finish. Handed the file to Holloway. Commander Holloway turned to face Dr. Hargrove, who stood at the back of the room flanked by 2 hospital board members and 3 FBI agents in dark windbreakers. Holloway's voice carried the weight of 40 decorated operators standing behind him, thousands of miles away but somehow present in the room. Senior Chief Torres is receiving the Defense Superior Service Medal today for the operation that officially never happened. She saved 16 hostages and 4 teammates in a black site extraction. Your hospital fired a national hero. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The silence that followed was the sound of careers ending. Hargrove's face drained like someone pulling a plug. His hand moved toward his pocket, a phone, car keys, anything. An instinct to run. One FBI agent stepped forward, dark suit and darker eyes. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, we've been examining your billing records for the past 72 hours. We've traced 17 attempts to forge Senior Chief Torres's employment history. We've documented 3 years of systematic insurance fraud related to Captain Torres's care. Another agent produced handcuffs. You're under arrest for wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and obstruction of federal investigation. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again like a fish drowning in air. I was protecting the hospital. She violated protocols. His voice climbed. Cracked. She had no right. No credentials on this unit. I was doing my job. The word spiraled into desperation, into rage. This is a setup. This is intimidation by the military-industrial complex. She lied about her qualifications. She's the criminal here. His hands balled into fists. You're letting her manipulate you all. Don't you see? She's dangerous. She's... Enough, the lead FBI agent said flatly. Handcuffs snapped closed around Hargrove's wrists with a sound like a door locking. He was escorted past the nurses' station where staff lined the hallway. No one spoke. No one looked away. They watched him walk in handcuffs past the unit where he'd lauded power like currency, their faces mirrors of the same quiet dignity Rachel had worn through every humiliation. One nurse, the one who'd left the break room when Rachel sat down, wiped her eyes. 5 years collapsed into and afterward. Rachel ran the VA's traumatic care unit now, reporting directly to the chief of surgery. The position came with an office, a parking spot, the chance to build something instead of hide in temp shifts. More importantly, it came with authority to protect people like Captain Torres. 3 veterans she'd saved came back to work in her department. One became her assistant director. The system she'd inherited, the one Hargrove had corrupted with kickback schemes and inflated billings, was rebuilt with protocols that screamed accountability. In her office on the 4th floor, mounted on the wall beside her medals, the bronze stars gleaming, the Navy Cross catching afternoon light, sat a pair of worn combat boots. Marcus's boots. The leather creased from 1,000 patrols, the laces frayed, the soles patterned with dust from Kandahar and Helmand and a dozen places the world would never map. She'd retrieved them from her locker the day she was hired permanently. Mounted them in a frame Marcus's mother had constructed from walnut and glass. Some warriors carry rifles into the dark. Others carry stethoscopes. Some fight battles that exist on no official manifest, save lives that the government denies were ever in danger. Rachel stood at her office window each morning before rounds, looking down at Denver spreading across the plains, and felt the weight of it, the restraint, the silence, the 17 deployments that had never happened. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that she could have stayed hidden forever. That part of her had wanted to. That walking into the light meant accepting that the 5 years of erasure were real and documented and would follow her always. But Captain Torres still breathed. The 16 hostages never made the news because the operation never existed, but Rachel knew their names. Knew their families. One had a daughter starting college. One had learned to paint again. At 6:11 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, a woman came to the trauma bay with a knife wound, 17 minutes from bleed out. Rachel walked in, eye scanning the scene the way she had 10,000 times before, and issued orders that moved like choreography, precise, economical, absolute. The residents and interns responded instantly. Not because she wore captain's bars. Because they'd learned what quiet authority sounded like. What expertise sounded like when it carried no arrogance. The woman lived. Rachel went to the break room at lunch and found it crowded. Someone had brought donuts. No one left when she sat down. She unwrapped her sandwich, turkey, avocado, the kind of mundane meal that tasted like freedom, and someone said, "Hey Senior Chief, tomorrow's your daughter's graduation from the academy, right?" 0600 ceremony, Rachel confirmed. She's walking point on the ceremonial unit. That's incredible. You must be proud. Rachel thought of Marcus's boots, still in their frame. Thought of her son in dress blues, handing her that classified file like a key to a door she didn't know she'd been locked behind. Thought of Captain Torres standing when everyone said he never would, and the word pride felt insufficient. Pride was small. Pride was civilian emotion. What she felt was something harder, colder, more precise, the satisfaction of a life that had meant something, even when no one could know it meant that. Dr. Hargrove, for what it's worth, was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall in Aurora by February. The name tag read Steve. His hands shook when customers arrived, he'd lost the muscle memory of authority. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. His wife had filed for divorce. His medical license hung revoked on the wall of a state office building in a file no one would ever request again. The FBI had found $847,000 in unmarked bills hidden in his safe deposit box. The hospital's ethics board had voted unanimously to remove his name from every plaque and publication he'd authored. His fall had been total and vivid and utterly deserved, the kind of reckoning that made younger administrators study his case as a lesson in what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. But Rachel didn't check. Didn't track his decline. Some people aren't worth tracking. She was too busy building something that would outlast his name, too focused on ensuring no one else would ever be terminated for saving a life. The thing about heroes who come home is that they don't stop coming home. They graduate. They marry. They have children who inherit their steadiness without inheriting their scars. Rachel stood at her daughter's academy graduation in June, uniform finally official again, standing beside her grown son in his captain's dress blues, and felt something like peace settle into the spaces that had been hollow. The boots were still in the office. They would always be in the office. Not as a reminder of what she'd lost, but proof of what she'd built in the ruins, a life of purpose, visible at last, but no less committed to the shadows. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you know someone who's been underestimated, who's been forced to hide their strength, who's been fired for doing the right thing, don't let their story end in silence. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind institutional corruption and the quiet warriors fighting back. Like this video if you believe hidden heroes deserve recognition. Comment, would you have stepped in for Rachel, or stayed silent?